Darling one, you were born from the sweetest love, cast from the fires of creation, burning bright into the making of your perfect constellations. Head high, my love, never let them diminish you. Stand tall in the power of your love. Break open to the thousands come before you, written in your heart with holy blood. Keep going, my love. Hold tight to the scripture of your inheritance, your dreams born from ancient stone. Weave your magic star of wisdom, breathing life into hollow bones. Courage, my love. Place pain upon your sacred altars. Grow seeds where life has become hopeless. Lend hands to those who fall and falter. Let love be life's greatest opus. Welcome, beautiful souls. My name is Tara Brading, and I'm the creator of the Dreaming the Ancestors podcast series, where we talk about remembering and reclaiming ancestral stories, feminine wisdom, and earth magic. And today I'm very excited to welcome Dougie MacKay to the podcast. Dougie is a storyteller from the Scottish Highlands, exploring the role of folk tales and myths in cultural revival and land-based living. He is prominent among Scotland's contemporary storytellers, hosting the bi-monthly Hearth Fire sessions and regularly selling out shows at Edinburgh Fringe and the Scottish International Storytelling Festival. His long-form storytelling engages subjects such as wolves in ecology and mythology and animism in old Celtic tales. He has travelled 4 continents telling stories, writes at Rekindling the Hearth on Substack, and works with the Shieling Collective in the Scottish Highlands. And I'm just so honoured to be here with you today, Dougie. Welcome to the podcast, and thank you for being here, and feel free to say a quick hello to everyone listening.
Thanks for having me, Tara, and hello to everyone out there listening.
Thank you, thank you. And as always, I'd love to begin our time together on this podcast by taking a moment just to close our eyes and imagine that we're having this conversation in the flesh, heart to heart, and we're sitting on the ground around a great fire. And as we gather around the fire, we share stories. We remember what it means to be people of the earth, people of lineage and culture, and to ultimately belong. And as we're holding this vision in our hearts and minds of being gathered at the fire, I'd love to take a moment for Dougie and I to honour our ancestors. And so I'd like to honour my Scottish ancestors, who I rarely talk about in my work, actually, as they are further back in my lineage. But I'm feeling them very strongly this morning as we come into this conversation. I'm feeling their connection to the land, to the great mountains and lochs, and the beauty that is Scotland, Alba. Honouring these ancestors and their passion for storytelling. Honouring the storytellers who are the memory keepers, the record keepers, feeling their wisdom flowing through the stories of old, allowing us to remember and reconnect with our sense of place and belonging. And so I honour these ancestors and welcome them to inspire me in this conversation. And with that, I'll pass over to you, Dougie.
Thanks, Tara. Welcoming in the people, the old ones, the ancient ones of the far, far north, of the flow country, of Mackay country, welcoming in, Mackays, Mackenzies and MacLeods. People rooted in the old clan culture. And also welcoming in the more dispersed ancestry from the Yorkshire Dales, from the big smoke of London town, from the heathlands in the northern part of Ireland, from Donegal. Yeah, may they be present, and may we speak, may we represent the best of them in our words today.
Honoring these ancestors and feeling them gathering around us at the fire. And so honored to feel their presence as we come together for this conversation. The title of this episode is Scottish Storytelling and Reviving Highland Culture. And it feels potent to share that Dougie and I actually met a few months ago at the Shieling Project in the Scottish Highlands, where Dougie and a team of others are actively reviving Highland culture and Gaelic heritage. And this is a really special land-based project where the Shieling team really brings people together to learn and practice ancestral skills and connect to the land, to sing and tell stories, and so much more. And we'll definitely talk more about this project later on in our conversation. So at the beginning of May at Bealtaine, I was visiting my friends Aoife and Shannon, both of whom have been on this podcast. And on my first night, I was incredibly tired and jet lagged, and you all gave me the warmest welcome. And I really cherish this memory of gathering around the fire. And Dougie, you shared a really beautiful story from the Scottish traditions, which inspired me to invite you to this podcast. And there's something so special about the oral storytelling tradition, which is really one of our most ancient and prolific ancestral practices. Storytellers were highly esteemed members of Gaelic society. They were the keepers of stories and old lore, but also history and genealogy. And they narrated and recited tales, but they were also these living record keepers and these custodians of tradition. And the Gaelic word for these storytellers is Seanachaidh, and their wisdom and stories were passed down orally from one generation to the next. And it's because of these storytellers that our ancestral myths and stories have survived, which feels really important to presence. And so I very much think of you, Dougie, as a modern day Seanachaidh, really standing tall on the shoulders of our storytelling ancestors. And I'm so excited to have this chat with you today. And this will include the story that Dougie shared with me on the first night in Scotland. And Dougie, I would love to hear a little bit more about how you became interested in Scottish storytelling and Gaelic culture. You know, was there a specific moment that initiated you onto this path, or did it happen slowly over time?
I was thinking about it earlier, and there's this moment in Finn and the Salmon of Wisdom where he gains this insight and he sees past, present, and future flowing together in one moment. So I'm going to give you the kind of past, present, and future to my interest in storytelling. So it did happen in a specific moment. It happened in Edinburgh, and it was as simple as just seeing someone telling stories. I'd been to lots of music gigs and DJs and seeing bands, and I saw someone just telling folk tales. My friend Daniel Allison. And in that moment, something really sparked. And this is the kind of history part where it's like, I feel like I recognized it. So I feel like in that moment, I saw a contemporary art form, but it really reminded me of the place I was from. And it really reminded me of, I guess, my own Highland culture, which wasn't always at the forefront of what I witnessed creatively growing up in the Highlands. But it did remind me somehow of my father, of my grandmother, of this tradition where storytelling's really just in the water up in the Highlands still. But it was radical to see it as a performance art. And I was like, oh, wait a minute, I kind of recognize that and think I could probably do it. And then the bit going forward was that I was about to become a father. And I sensed that actually stories could be really powerful and they could be a really beautiful thing to surround a child with. And the more I read, the more there were people like Einstein and Rudolf Steiner and various other philosophers and thinkers that were really championing the idea of surrounding children with stories and fairy tales. So yeah, that was a bit of the inspiration too. I was like, okay, I feel that this is important. I feel like I recognize this. And I want my daughter to access that. I want that to be a point of connection between us. So that's something of the moment where it really came alive for me.
Wow, so special to hear that. And really feeling that power of lineage and story, right? And the stories that we pass down to the next generations, the stories we receive from the generations before. And there's like this through line of connection in that way. And I love that you talked about storytelling being in the waters in the Highlands. And I feel like storytelling is like this river, and it takes different turns through time. It evolves in different ways, right? But ultimately there's this essence, this current that remains the same and connects it all together. And so that was really lovely to hear about the inspiration of your daughter. Could you tell us a little bit about your process when you're learning a new story? Do you learn the story from another storyteller in that lineage way of, receiving it from someone further back in the lineage, I suppose? And, how do you go about remembering the story?
I mean, this is the sort of thing we could talk about for a long, long time. And every story might be slightly different. Every storyteller would do it slightly differently. It is easier to learn a story from another person. And certainly when I first got interested in storytelling, we do have this kind of living tradition of storytelling in Scotland. There are storytelling elders that were at the forefront or were the foundation of the storytelling revival that kind of happened in the 80s and the 90s. So certainly at the start, I was going to tradition bearers, I was going to like some contemporary storytellers, but also a lot of the elders, and being like, yeah, what is the etiquette around story? What is the localized style? And I was fascinated by this heritage, because before then I was going elsewhere for heritage. I was going elsewhere for wisdom traditions. And I was like, wow, there's something here in Scotland that's been preserved that is really interesting. So that would be my foundation. And over the years, I've kind of moved beyond Scotland a little bit, and I've had mentors from other places. But how do I learn a story? It's always different, and it's quite a long process. But I think like, if I was to give like one takeaway answer, it's more about stepping into the world of the story than it is remembering words. Like the words are different every time. Usually. Most stories, it's okay for them to change and meander. Some stories are strict, and they would be the ones that you would repeat, not quite word for word, but you wouldn't change anything. But I feel like stories really come alive when we approach them kind of like living beings, or you sense the world of story is an imaginal realm that actually exists. And rather than reciting a bunch of words, you step into that world of the story. You're like, yeah, what was the character doing? How did the land look on this day? Why did they do that? What does the wise woman's voice sound like? What does the wise woman have in her home? And if we engage with each of those questions with a kind of like earnest curiosity, and maybe even add our own research to that, like it's good for stories to have cultural integrity and ecological integrity. But I feel like that is the process. That's how I would approach stories now, is that almost like stepping into them and trying to witness the story from within, rather than it just being something I'm reciting. And there are a bunch of different storytelling tips and tricks and processes, from remembering to crafting to telling to, it's a whole craft that can really be a lifetime of practice. But yeah, I think that one step makes a big difference. Can you step into the world of the story and experience that world rather than just speaking words?
That makes so much sense. And it's how I experience story as well. It's like a portal into another realm or another time or someone else's perspective. And so it makes perfect sense that as the storyteller, you'd have to completely immerse yourself in the realm of that story and to really feel yourself there and imagine yourself there. And, this is where there's a very magical element to storytelling and this sense of actually going into the other world to kind of like channel the story is what I'm hearing in your share, and then to transport people in that way when you're telling the story. I actually had this really interesting dream the other night where I was in a library and I kept opening these books, and it was a form of time travel. Every time I'd open a book, I would travel somewhere else in time. It was a very fun dream. But that's how I feel about books and stories. It's really this way of transporting us somewhere else, but then it also brings us so much wisdom about our life. We kind of take the treasures of the story and the realm wherever we go, and we bring it into our everyday lives. And so, yeah, that was beautiful to hear you talk about that. And the story that you shared with me in Scotland is called Makers of Dreams, which is also written down in your book, Scottish Tales for Telling, which I really recommend to everyone listening. And it's such a lovely story that I would absolutely love for you to share it with everyone who's listening so they can be transported into that wonderful realm and feel the power of the land and the Highlands really shining through that story.
Nice. Yeah, I'd be happy to tell that. It's one of my favorite tales for telling. It comes from the Isle of Skye, and it was passed on to me by an older storyteller called David Campbell. He's in his 90s now, and I think he found it in a book of stories collected by a woman called Otta Swire. So that's the kind of heritage of the story. It was a clear, late summer's day on the island of Skye. And there was a group of young women that were on the lower slopes of the sharp Coolin Mountains. And they were out on the lower slopes and they were gathering blaeberries or blueberries. And they had woven baskets on their arms, they had shawls upon their shoulders, and as they walked and they gathered the blaeberries, they talked. They chatted, they gossiped about what had been happening in their village and the next, who'd been seeing who'd been up to what mischief. And as they walked and they talked and they gathered, there was one amongst them who couldn't follow the chatter. For her eye kept being drawn up to the sharp peak of the mountain. And as she stared at the sharp peak of the mountain, she remembered the stories she had heard about the giants, about the spirits that dwelled at the top of that mountain. And as her eye trailed back down, she saw, wait a minute. Further up the hillside, there are more abundant berry bushes. And so she left the path, she went higher, gathering these blaeberries. She placed a few in the basket, a few in her mouth, until her fingers and lips were stained delightfully purple. And eventually her belly and her basket were full, and it was only then that she turned and saw just how far she had wandered. For she stared down and saw that her friends were like ants on the lower slopes of the mountains, and before she could call out to them, whoosh, in it swept from the wild Atlantic a thick sea mist, so thick that she could barely see her hand in front of her face. And on this sort of terrain, with the rocks and ravines, if you can't see, you can't move. One false step could be the end of you, and so she was left there high in the mountain, praying for this mist to lift. As she sat there waiting and wondering, she remembered those stories of the spirits and of the giants, and remembered how those stories don't always end well. She sat for what seemed like an age, praying that this mist would finally lift, until through the bleakness she heard a sound. Tss, tss, tss. Hello? She called out, but no voice echoed in return. Again she heard the sound of footsteps on stone. Tss, tss, tss. Until, emerging from the mist, two great horns, surely the devil himself, and she was just about to scream, when from the mist came a stag, a many-pointed deer. And this red deer was followed by a hind, by another, a whole herd of deer up in the hills. And she was so grateful to see this peaceful creature and not some demon that she moved towards them. They turned, they gazed at her, they fixed their hazel eyes upon hers, and they were quite tame. They let her approach, and she was comforted by the presence of these peaceful creatures. They sat, they browsed, they rested a while, and then, all as one, they lifted up, they stood up, and they made their way back through the mist, and the girl thought, I would rather follow the deer than sit here on my own. So sticking close to the herd, she followed them as they led her higher up into the hills, led her along a ridge, along a high mountain path, until eventually they came between two great stones, and as they passed between these stones, the mist lifted. She was in a high green gully. There was a stream running clear. She drank from the stream. She refreshed herself, but the deer carried on ascending, higher, higher, higher. And so she followed the deer as they climbed the hill until they came to the mouth of a cave. And when they came to the mouth of the cave, an old voice piped up from within it. Ah, my beauties, you've come. And hobbling out of the cave was an old, old woman, as old as the mountain itself. A smoky bird's nest of grey hair behind her head, but her eyes glittering green. And she flashed a glance at the deer, and then at the girl, and said, Ah, and you brought someone with you. She called back into the cave in some old language that none of us would even recognize, let alone understand. And then hobbling out from the cave came an old, old man as old as the ocean. And these two old ones, they spoke in this ancient dialect for a while before the old woman turned to the girl and she asked her. She said, What is your business? What brings you here? What do you want? And the girl said, Grandmother, I was gathering blaeberries. The mist came down, the deer arrived, I followed them, and they led me here. Night is falling. I'll never make it back to my village in time, but if you can just offer me shelter for this one night, I promise I'll be no trouble. Tomorrow I'll be gone. And again the old one spoke in this ancient dialect before the old woman turned and shook her head and said, You cannot stay for a night. You cannot stay for a day, but you may stay for a year and a day. For we have much work to do and much that we can teach. And what choice did the girl have? She would never make it home before nightfall. And so it was agreed, and they slept by the glowing embers of the peat fire that night. And the next day, just after dawn, they put the girl to work. The old woman took her down onto the slopes of the mountain, and they gathered herbs. They gathered wild thyme and mint and mugwort. Bog myrtle, they gathered these herbs, they dried them in bunches in the cave. They kindled a fire. They went to the deer and they took a pail, a metal bucket, and they milked each of the deer, gathering the deer's milk in the bucket. Once the flames had died down and the coals were burning bright upon the fire, they took this bucket and they heated it upon the fire, stirring it always sunwise. Eventually this milk, it hardened into a soft white cheese that we call crowdie. And all the while that the girl and the old woman were doing this, the old man sat in the back of the cave. And once the crowdie, the cheese, was ready, they took the old man this bucket of cheese, and the girl saw that he sat low on a stool, and he stared into a pool. And in that pool there were many patterns, there were shapes, some that she recognized, but some that were clearly not of this world. There were colours, there was crimson, there was gold, there was pink. And without looking up, the old man reached into that bucket of cheese and took a handful of the soft cheese. He started sculpting, he started moulding, and he formed a sculpture And the first one he held up was beautiful. It was exquisite. It was like an eagle in flight. And he laid that upon a shelf. And he reached back into the bucket. He took another handful of cheese. He sculpted, he molded. And this time, the sculpture he made was hideous, like some demonic beast. And he placed that on another shelf. Until the old man spent the day, he stared into the pool, he reached into the bucket, he made these sculptures, some beautiful, some terrifying. And at the end of the day, once the sun began to sink in the west, he took these trays of the sculptures, lifted them up, and they were painted with the colours of the setting sun. Peach, purple, pink. In one hand, he lifted up these images of beauty, and from the sky swooped birds, came golden eagles. Swallows and swifts ducked and danced through the sky. The bold little robin and the wren, they came, and they carried off these images of beauty in the four directions. And in his other hand, he held up these terrifying images. And with a squawk came carrion eaters, corvids, crows, and they came down in a flurry of black feathers and snatched these images from his hand and likewise flew away in the four directions. Day after day, the girl learned each of these tasks. She learned how to kindle the fire on her own. She learned to identify and gather the herbs on her own. She learned to keep the deer calm as she gathered their milk. She learned to heat the milk upon the fire and make the soft cheese. And eventually she learned to sit with the old man beside this pool. She learned to craft, to sculpt these images with her own bare hands. She learned to hold her nerve as the birds flew from the sky and carried these sculptures from her hands out into the world. She learned much from those old ones, and she learned that these old ones were the makers of dreams. This is how and where dreams were made. And the dreams were carried into the world by these birds. The beautiful images that were held up and carried by the eagle, the swallow, and the swift, they were delivered to people sleeping in their beds. And the people who were visited by these images, by these birds, they awoke with a spring in their step, with hope in their heart. And nothing could diminish their mood for days or weeks to come. But those that were visited by the corvids, by the crows, that received these terrifying images, they awoke in a cold sweat, with a twist in their stomach and a deep sense of foreboding. But each were delivered equally, for such is the way of dreaming. And before she knew it, her time was up. "A year and a day have passed, young one, you must go." And she said, "Can I not stay a little longer? I feel like there's still so much left to learn." And the old ones shook their head and said, "A year and a day have passed. You must leave." And so many words of gratitude and blessing were spoken, many tears were shed. And eventually the girl parted from the old ones, made her way from the cave again, following the deer. And they led her down into that same gully with the clear crystal stream. They led her between the two stones, along the ridge. They led her down past the blaeberry bushes, which again were in fruit. The deer led her to a sandy crescent moon bay. And there she said goodbye to each of these deer because they'd become like pets to her. And after she'd said goodbye to the deer, she went to make her way past them, and they blocked her path. And she moved this way and that, and the deer kept blocking her. She said, "What's the meaning of this? Why won't you let me pass?" And the deer all as one turned to face the western ocean. And as she followed the deer's gaze, she saw something bobbing out in the water. A coracle, a cowskin boat. And as it came closer, she saw someone paddling that boat, and she saw that around their neck was a golden torque, the band of great importance or even royalty. And as they came to the shallows of the water, they jumped from the boat, they pulled it behind them, splashing through the water, and turned to the girl and said, "You are here, I knew you would be here." for every night. For a year and a night in my father's halls. In a kingdom far to the west, I have dreamed of you in this very place. And everyone thought I was mad, but I knew I had to follow this dream. I had to come to this very beach. I knew I would find you here, and I had to come and ask you if you would return with me to my island kingdom. And of course, being that sort of story, she agreed. And hopped in the boat, they bobbed across 9 waves or more. And in time, she became the queen of that island kingdom. And in her time, they understood much about the ways of dreaming. They understood about the making of dreams, about the understanding of dreams, about the following of dreams. In her time, they understood the importance of straying from the well-trodden path, of following in the footsteps of the deer, of spending time up in the mountains at the seat of the old ones. But her time was long ago, and since then, much has been forgotten. Sinead, that's the tale.
So, so beautiful to receive that story again. And I'm as moved now as I was when you first told it. And just so many different threads in the story that speak to me. The following of the deer, the dreams, the old man and the old woman who feel like the grandmother and grandfather of the land. And I love what you shared at the end about how our ancestors, how our people used to know how to follow the dreams and how to be with the dreams. And that feels like such a beautiful teaching to be with at the end of this story. And as I was listening to, I was reminded of something that I heard from an Indigenous elder when I was in Ecuador many years ago now, an elder from the Kogi tribe. And this man was telling me that every place, every land has a mother and father of the land. And I was really feeling that in the story with the old ones as being the mother and father of the Isle of Skye, but in a broader sense, Alba. And I was actually wondering, do you have any sense of who these two beings are, or are they just the old man, the old woman, and that's that? Do you have a sense that maybe there's something more to discover there?
Nice reflection. Like the term Cailleach and Bodach simply mean old man, old woman in Scotland and Ireland. And these characters almost exist on a spectrum. Like the Cailleach is sometimes presented as the goddess who created the land itself, an ancient winter goddess who carved the mountains, who formed the land, who existed in a time when there was no land, there was only water and darkness. So there's a grandiosity to her in this form, but then also she's just an old woman, someone you might meet on the street or someone who you might meet by the fire. So I sense this character in the story is hinting at the Cailleach. And often the Cailleach in the stories is seen milking the deer up in the hill. So that's consistent with a lot of the folklore and imagery. But in this story, she's not a goddess as such. She's kind of on that cusp between our world and the next world. So yeah, she's hinting at the goddess, at least at the Cailleach, and the old man is maybe the same, hinting at the Bodach. And I sense, it's not quite the question you asked, but I sense that there's something ancient that has been preserved in Scotland that I think we still kind of resonate with. There's something, I think the stone, like literally the land in Scotland, the stone in the north of Scotland is some of the oldest in the world. And maybe that does something. Maybe that has a certain resonance. And being an edge place, being a place up on the edge of Europe, being a place on the edge of the water, I feel like the old culture is preserved in a way that is different from being somewhere more central. So I feel like what we lose up here in terms of like innovation and being ahead of the curve, we compensate for in retaining that old memory. So the story kind of represents that for me a little bit, that old memory, these old ones that, You know, they're of the human world, but they're also not of the human world. And that's quite a consistent theme in Scottish stories, this idea of the supernatural, of things happening just beyond the veil in a way that everyday people cross the veil, and those beings on the other side of the veil in that magical world also come and visit us. There are many, what they would call thin places in Scotland where these stories seem to take place.
I was really hoping you would talk about the kayak. And yeah, I recognize those themes and motifs. And I love what you shared about her being, you know, on the threshold of like this mortal grandmother and then this deeper energy of the goddess, and
Mm.
her kind of having a foot in both. And that feels really potent and really beautiful, and something I see in so many stories, right? Where it's simply an old woman, but then there's something deeper behind her as this archetypal energy of this old energy that is as old as the stones. Yeah, I feel her as an edge dweller as well. That's how I always relate with her, is this being who walks in the wild at the in the isolated places and the places where you wouldn't expect to find anyone, right? Anyone living. And then there's her. And in hearing the story again, I'm reminded of what you were sharing earlier about really needing to inhabit the story and embody the story that's being told. And to me, it feels like this is when an ancestral story like this is told well. And it has this sort of ancient, timeless quality. Like, there are moments when I was closing my eyes listening to you, and I feel like you could have been sharing this story 1,000 years ago, right? It's like there's a timelessness to it. And it's that energy that connects us to that river of memory. And my personal understanding is that this is what the Seanachaidh was tasked with, that connection to lineage through time, that timelessness that connects us to the ones who've gone before and to the land, and helping people to connect with their lineage and their history through storytelling and story making. And I'm really curious to hear your reflections on the Seanachaidh, and wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about them in a traditional sense.
Yeah, maybe I start again with this reference point of Finn and the Salmon of Wisdom. Because as you were talking about time there, the thing that really distinguishes Finn from the others in the age of the Fianna is that he understands how past, present, and future flow together as a confluence of many streams into one river. And that's held up as being the key to true seeing, to true wisdom in, an Irish, Scottish, Gaelic, Celtic cosmology. And I feel like that's what the Seanachaidhs were doing. They were tasked with preserving the long memory. And that can be really functional. That can be like which clan battled with who and who intermarried with who, where is a particular healing spring for a certain ailment, which plants have which healing qualities. So some of it's very place-based and very particular to a certain people of time and place. It's very regional. Every clan would have their own Seanachaidh, who would be the living library. They'd be tasked with preserving the oral history. And yeah, they had to be entertaining, because if you're not entertaining, no one listens, But they wouldn't change the details for the sake of making it more entertaining. Actually, what was important was preserving the culture, preserving the oral history. So certainly the remaining Seanachaidhs that I've met or interacted with in Scotland were quite strict about certain stories that you just don't change. I would say probably the term is a bit broader nowadays, but there would have been a time where in Gaelic Scotland, the Seanachaidh was the living library. They were responsible for preserving the culture, and they just didn't change the stories. And they would be tasked with carrying thousands of tales. And I think what I find also curious is, so there was a Seanachaidh up in Skye called Shorus, George McPherson, who was of this clan lineage, who'd been getting trained from like the age of 5 or 3 or something ridiculous. And he had some stories that were like so specific to his region of Skye. He'd be telling me stories about the Glendale cabbage, which wasn't really what I was excited by. But those stories would be equally important to him as the stories of fairies and of mermaids and the Fianna and all of the slightly bigger tales. But also, he was really interested in the world. You know, like the Shenachaidhs would have this local knowledge, but certainly in his time, they would travel and exchange these tales with people from North America, from Japan, with Australian Aborigines. And more often than not, there'd actually be some commonality between these different older cultures and the stories and the beliefs and the way that they saw the world. So, yeah, that's my understanding of a Seanachaidh. I think it used to mean keeper of the old lore. In the high day of the Gaelic culture, they would have been esteemed characters. And over time, with the decline of the Gaelic culture, they became more like storytellers, you know, more like to entertain kids with fun fairy stories. But once upon a time, they had a more important cultural role. And I think we half remember that in Scotland. I wouldn't say it's fully penetrated the modern culture, but I think we half recognise the importance of the storyteller still to this day.
That's so fascinating, and it makes so much sense that there are stories that have a very practical, functional role that connect people very deeply to a place, like the cabbage, right? Yep. And it's indicative of what we've lost as people, like our really deep connection to a very specific place and regionality, and then you have the complete other end of the spectrum of like sharing stories across the world and finding similarities. And so just feeling the depth and also the breadth of this tradition and the ways that our ancestors would have shared stories with people from afar and exchanged stories. And that was a really beautiful way of honoring each other's cultures. So yeah, just feeling the beauty of this as a living tradition. And I love what you were sharing about the Seanachaidh who was being trained from the age of 3 or 5 or what have you, and being part of that very distinct lineage and tradition. And yes, it's very much a living tradition, right? And something that I wanted to talk about as well is your role at the Shieling Project and really uplifting that living tradition of storytelling. And so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the Shieling Project and why this project is so meaningful to you personally.
We're kind of reviving what was the Shieling Project. So there's a project ran in the north of Scotland that was looking at, I guess, traditional culture as a mode for teaching about the environment. And it rose and fell. And then there's a group of us took on this project that have slightly adapted that vision. But we're, I guess, celebrating traditional culture. We're trying to create a hub where people can come and experience the different aspects of Highland culture, of land-based living. Story, Gaelic song, craft, growing food, being together by the fire. So sometimes it's actually just being together by the fire in a wild place is also powerful. We've been kind of working there for about 18 months. There's been a lot of trial and error. I feel like next year, 2027, we'll have probably a more full program. This year, there's been a lot of background tending, like, you know, getting a board of directors in place and doing all this less traditional, slightly more boring stuff. But it's a gorgeous place to come and visit. It's west of Inverness. And yeah, we essentially host gatherings. And sometimes there'll be a specific emphasis. It might be a basket weaving weekend, or it might be a traditional song weekend. Yeah, there was one recently that was more explicitly exploring decolonization. And I guess what we're looking to do is create something that has value for local people, you know, where they can come and spend a day on the land and witness somewhere that's actually championing and showcasing Highland culture, which at times can be a bit fragile. It can feel a bit fragile. There's not loads of people keeping this stuff alive. And then also be a place where if people want to come to Scotland and get a slightly deeper experience, a cultural experience, a land-based experience, an experience of hospitality. We're hoping that is the place to go, because if you currently come to Scotland, there's nowhere else like this. There's actually almost like a living site on the land that's really leaning into traditional culture. There's museums and there's places that are kind of heritage places you can go and visit, but not really places where you can go and participate for a weekend or a week. And I think that's where, the experience of all these things we've talked about, it becomes more tangible. Like you can get a felt sense of the culture, a felt sense of the land, a felt sense of the Cailleach or the mythos or the things that are harder to put into words. And ideally, we become that place where you can come, get a sense of that and be recharged by the land and by the culture, and that relationship is reciprocal. That by creating such a place, we strengthen the culture. And we remind Highlanders that there's something worth preserving here, that the songs are important, the stories are important, natural land-based lifeways are important, traditional crafts are important, because if no one's championing them, they get forgotten. And there's more and more being lost every year in Scotland, I would say. So that's why it's important for me. It's important to preserve it. It's important to have that gathering place. And it just feels very alive when we do this, when we gather in these ways. Like, it's hard to beat that experience. That's where I want to be. I want to be in those environments. I want to be telling stories. I want to be hearing people singing songs. I want to be crafting. And just meeting people in mind and heart and keeping our hands busy too.
Love your reflections on that. And I can really attest to that aliveness, which I felt when I was there. And we had this lovely Bealtaine gathering with some local families, and we sang more than we talked. And we sat around the fire and everyone shared at least one song. And it was just so special. And I think it's something that so many people are longing for and hungry for, even if maybe they don't quite know that's what they're longing for. And so I feel the deep importance. And it's partly why I wanted to have you on this podcast, to really express that, and for listeners to really, look up the Shieling Project and see what you're up to there, and to go and have an experience. And like you said, it's very rare to actually have a place to go and experience this. And, on this podcast, we talk a lot about these living traditions and ancient wisdom and all of these things, but to actually have a place to go is very, very special. So just can't recommend it enough to people who are listening, whether you live in Scotland or you are in the diaspora and want to visit Scotland. So thank you for sharing that with all of us.
I feel like at the Shieling, we're really at this time of like calling out for allies. Like I sense it's a place where it can support many people's dreaming. I feel there's many people near and far who share this yearning for this sort of place in Scotland. And next year, 2027, we'll have a program where you can come and visit. But in the meantime, find us through all the usual digital places. Like, sorry to break the magic, but, send us a message on Instagram. We're probably going to run some Gaelic online stuff through the winter. We'll do a raffle. Because again, like, funding is something we're constantly needing to do. So through the winter, come and say hi, send us a message, and we're really welcoming more participation, more support through the winter as well as next year during courses.
Thank you for speaking to that really practical piece. It's so important, right? Like, we need money to make all of these beautiful things happen. So really calling in those supporters, for those who are listening, to uplift this amazing project. And I have another question related to this topic. I know there's a growing movement of people in Scotland who are feeling this call to revive Highland culture, and you're actively putting out the call to welcome in those people to support the Shieling Project specifically. And it feels important to share a little bit of context about this. So, could you tell us a little bit? I mean, this could be a whole podcast episode in and of itself, but could you tell us a little bit about the impact of British colonialism in the Highlands and some of the ongoing challenges of keeping Highland culture alive?
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for welcoming it. It's a difficult subject to talk about well, but maybe I would just talk about the past and then a little bit about the present. So after the Battle of Culloden, we had a phase where Gaelic culture was kind of outlawed and certainly oppressed, and they established three military forts: Fort George, Fort Augustus, Fort William, to keep an eye on the Gaelic people. But the clan system was unraveled. They were, disassociated. Anyone who'd supported the Jacobite uprising lost their land. So you've got a huge shift in land ownership in the Highlands in the 1750s. Gaelic language is illegal, or it's called Irish to make it sound foreign in the newspapers. English is spoken in the courts, so you can't defend yourself in Gaelic. Tartan is outlawed, bagpipes are outlawed, people aren't allowed to carry arms. So there's 50 years of kind of really, I guess it's a kind of cultural genocide, if nothing else, and also the land changes hands. 50 years later, you've got the beginning of the Highland Clearances. You've got a change of land ownership in the middle 1700s. 50 years later, sheep are more profitable than people. So people are driven from their homes, often violently. By this point, the people have kind of lost their fight. You know, there's a line in a song that says, where is our strong Highland metal? Our men now huddled like cattle, ready to be shipped over the ocean. So the culture is crushed over 50 years, and then we have 100 years of people being cleared from the glens. The clan system wasn't a system of land ownership. It was a system of belonging to a place. But you'd have families who had cultivated a piece of land over generations. They had built their own homes with their own materials and at their own expense. They had a kind of hereditary right to it. But once the land changed hands, or with this new kind of anglicized way of relating to land, they had no rights. So they were cleared, and hence many people ended up in North America. So this lasted for 100 years, throughout the 1800s. Kind of overlaps with the famine in Ireland. So 150 years of that, you end up with I would sense, quite a broken culture. And this is not really spoken about. Like, we don't do this in school. I went to Culloden Academy. I went to a secondary school that is a stone's throw from Culloden battlefield. But we don't really learn about that. We learn about the Second World War and Nazism. So we get British history. Most of our news comes from London. And we've got a strange relationship, I would say. I mean, my mum's English. I'm half English. So it's not like an anti-English thing. It's just recognizing there's a dominant culture, and Gaelic or Highland culture continues to be squeezed. And how that might look nowadays is different. It's through things like Airbnb. It's through things like second homes for people further south, or people retiring in London and moving up. And you can't blame people for doing that. But over time, the culture is just lost. It just changes. And it's the quiet bits of the culture. It's more obvious when the songs and the language, and it's more obvious when these things are lost. But there's also things like accents that are lost. There's also things like just a way of being, a way that you might gather at New Year's Eve. And yeah, there's a sweetness to the Highland culture that feels a little bit in jeopardy, which is really, it's painful for me as a Highlander who's grown up with it. And it's I don't know that there's an answer to that, but it's definitely something that happens. And I think it's probably really normal. I think it's probably around the world where there's a dominant culture and a regional subculture, I think often these dominant cultures just expand through a kind of osmosis. And that's a little flavour of what's happening in the Scottish Highlands as I see it. And I'm not an expert. People could give you a much more thorough answer, and other people would totally disagree. But that's my perspective.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And, we've been talking about these beautiful Highland stories and, the makers of dreams and all these beautiful aspects of the storytelling tradition. And this part of the story needs to be told as well, is how I feel anyways, which is why I wanted to bring that invitation forward to tell that story.
And just to add to it, and sometimes it's a lack of confidence. Sometimes I think because most of our media comes from London or North America, certain things get championed. Like when I was a teenager, everyone was copying like Britpop indie bands from like Manchester or London because that's what's on television, or that's what we heard in the radio. And I think that's why it was radical when I went to Edinburgh and actually saw someone telling stories. As soon as I saw it, I recognized it, but you don't see that in the television. You don't hear it on the radio. You seldom even hear accents that are similar to ours. So I think it's like, yeah, as well as the outside culture, which is strong and dominant, I think sometimes like regional cultures lack the confidence and the articulation to really stand up for what's theirs. And I would love for there to be, like part of my mission is to create that sort of space in the Shieling where it's easy for people to come, see it, feel it, sense the potency and get inspired and be like, wait a minute, I can do that too. I can gather songs, I can practice craft. I'm going to phone my granny and see which stories she's still carrying. So yeah, I feel like those two pieces are connected somehow.
Yeah, absolutely. That important role modeling and creating the visibility to show a different way, right? To show a different story and a different culture that exists outside of this dominant culture. And so I'm really, really hearing and sitting with that story of the dominant culture and also the land, like actual access, physical access to the land. And as far as I understand, there's still so many large English estates in Scotland, like tens of thousands of acres, right?
Yeah, it's hard to put the E word on things without causing controversy. Usually it tends to be not Highlanders who own the estates. People from afar who have a huge amount of wealth and they have tracts of land of like 40,000 acres or more. And that's how Scotland is carved up. And it's unparalleled in Europe or what they call the Western world, the way Scotland is carved up. It still feels like a kind of wealthy person's playground in some ways. And so having like a little patch that's like, actually, this is for the people, like that feels worth protecting. And it feels like it's a really small part of the revival or the change that's needed in these times.
And all that context is so important. And it emphasizes the importance of the Shieling Project and what is going on there. And part of why I was so moved when I was there, right? And as someone who holds a lot of English ancestry, it feels important to be really honest about this story and the importance of uplifting, whether it's Gaelic culture or Brythonic culture or what have you, within the Celtic nations. And so I'm just very, very grateful for you speaking to this and for the work that you're all doing at the Shieling. And again, just really encouraging listeners, now that you have this context as well, to really understand the importance of it and to support it in whatever way that you can.
Thank you. And just really want to clarify, capitalism is a force of its own. The British government are a force of their own, as they have been historically. And most of us who live in a landmass, I'm sure you can empathize with this, not all of us living somewhere are in favor of the behavior of our government.
Yes. Absolutely. And as someone who spent a lot of my childhood in England, we don't learn about this history either. And so speaking to it is also part of the awareness of coming into a deeper understanding of our history, of our ancestral history, our collective history, and then we can be better allies to people who are trying to do this work, right? So that's a big prayer I'm holding in my heart around all of this.
Nice. Yeah, thank you. It's a good prayer.
So one last question. For those who want to be part of Scotland's cultural revival, what is one small thing that you would recommend, both for people in Scotland and also those who are living in the diaspora?
I mean, that's such a vast question. I want to start again with a kind of like a slightly abstract answer. So when I started telling stories, the advice I got was the key to being a good storyteller is being a good listener. And I think listening goes a long way. And I think being a good ally, like sometimes involves like paying attention, getting out of the way a little bit, like getting on top of our own agendas and yeah, listening to songs, stories, the landscape. Um, but yeah, how to engage with the culture. I mean, I'm biased. I love stories. I think stories give us a flavor of how people have been in an area for a long time. We catch echoes of the land, we catch echoes of the culture, we catch the values, the belief system, all that comes through folktales. So I think that's a really good way of starting to engage with Scottish culture from afar. The music too, the feeling of the music, it's very particular the way the music feels. Songs carry a lot of value. And yeah, and then I don't know if you can actually, if you're serious, it's probably a case of visiting and allowing some spaciousness in that journey. And again, maybe doing the research, like if you're going to buy stuff on your trip, are there local craftspeople who are still making? Can you support kind of really genuine artisans that are still keeping the old crafts alive? Yeah. And of course, we live in the modern world. You can do things online. You can start to do online courses. And I think there's many, many ways, but that would be a little smattering. But I think stories, land, culture, craft, listening, being in relationship. I think in Scotland, like we still really value relationship, like actually just meeting as humans. And we've still got Gaelic culture. There's still a value to being by the fire. And okay, this is a nice one. So, and if you come to Scotland, have something to offer when you're by the fire. I know in North America, like gifting is a really strong part of the culture. That's something I've learned when I was over there. And over here, having something as a form of entertainment, having a song, having a story, having a poem, having a joke, like call it crack, like being a bit of crack, like that goes a long way in Scotland. So yeah, arriving with a willingness to meet people by the fire, by the hearth, in a circle, and have something to offer in that sort of space. I think if you've got that, actually your journey in Scotland will open up. And yeah, I think that's the key, actually, having something to offer in those spaces, being open to right relationship with people.
Such beautiful advice. And there's so much wisdom in what you shared. The listening. I'm always telling my students, listen, can we be in that listening? Because that really is the path to relationship. And I love that wisdom too about having something to offer rather than, oh, I'm just coming to take something, right? Because that's more of that extractive energy that actually we need a little bit less of as humans, as in general, right? And especially when we're going to places that have been, historically oppressed or what have you. So, yeah, what can I give? Do I have something meaningful that I could give when I'm sitting at a fire or I'm in someone's home or whatever it is? So that feels really, really beautiful. Beautiful advice.
Yeah, nice question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dougie. I am so grateful for our amazing conversation today and would love to give you the chance to tell people where to find you and also the Shieling Project and just anything you want to share with people so they can go deeper into these teachings and your work.
Yeah, I mean, the easiest place is obviously online. So my website is rekindlingthehearth.com. I also write in Substack at the same title, Rekindling the Hearth. I'm starting a story mentorship program in September, but that's kind of full actually. But if people are interested in going on a 9-month journey of cultivating storytelling skill. That's something I offer. People could write to me. I do an online course in the winter, coming out of the winter, called Myth as Medicine, where we take one old story a week and go deep with that one story and catch the kind of tonic, the medicinal quality in that story each week. And that's a really nice way of coming out of the winter. Do lots of things in person, but that obviously changes through the year. I'm on Instagram, just Dougie MacKay Story. And we've got this site up at the Shieling. And as I say, we're really calling in more allies, is my sense of it. And there will be courses through the brighter months, kind of April to September. And then through the winter, things online. So check out the Shieling website, send us a message, and say, hey, I'm interested in this, that, or the next thing. And that's how we know that we're on the right track and we know what people are after.
And just to make sure people find the Shieling Project, could you spell that for everyone?
Yeah, hopefully I get it right. I always spell it wrong. It's Shieling. And if they need a word association, it's like it was the old summer dwelling up in the hills. People would go up to the Shielings in the hill with their livestock, and they would graze their livestock up on the fresh pasture up in the hill, then come down to the village through the winter. So that's what a Shieling means.
And just to finish this share about Dougie's work, I want to also spell Dougie's name in case you want to look up Dougie and you're not sure how to spell his name. So it's DougiMacKay. Thank you all so much for listening to our conversation today, and would love to just invite us for just a brief moment to reimagine ourselves sitting around that fire together and to really feel the power of sharing story, sharing the stories of heritage, the stories of history, the story of the land itself, and the story of who we are as a people when we dig into our ancestral roots. And I also really want to honor and share gratitude with those ancestors that we honored and called in at the very beginning of this conversation, honoring the storytellers, the ancestors from Scotland, the ones who have preserved culture through time, even through times of hardship. I really hope that you've been nourished by this time at the fire, and I really hope that you'll also explore Dougie's work and the Shieling Project as a follow-up to this conversation. So thank you all so much. Until next time. You've been listening to Dreaming the Ancestors with Tara Brading. My passion is connecting women to the wisdom of their ancestors, specializing in ancestral feminine wisdom from Ireland and England. If you feel called to connect with your Irish ancestry in an embodied, spiritual, feminine way, I lovingly invite you to sign up for my free reclamation journey, which includes a 90-minute video to connect with your Irish ancestry and ancient heritage. And if you hear the call to connect with your English ancestry, I have a 3-hour introductory workshop called Women of the Wells. You can find these offerings at tara-wild.com/get started. To spell that out, that's TARA-WILD.com/get started.